It was the dead of night, March 9, 1945. The skies over Tokyo were choked with the sound of roaring engines, a constant, insistent hum growing louder by the second. From the ground, the city's skyline, once the proud symbols of Japan's imperial might, seemed to dissolve into an inferno. In the blink of an eye, firestorms tore through the heart of Tokyo, consuming everything in their path. Buildings, homes, factories, all reduced to ash, swallowed by the raging inferno. For the Japanese commanders, this was no longer just a raid, it was a reckoning. The B-29 superfortresses, seemingly unstoppable, had returned. The raid that began hours earlier had only just begun its deadly work. What had once seemed like a brief disruption now stretched into an endless barrage of destruction. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of burning cities, the smell of death and despair hanging in the air. In the control rooms of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, officers stood in stunned disbelief. This was no isolated attack, no fleeting moment of terror. This was the unrelenting force of a new, overwhelming power, and it showed no signs of stopping. The Japanese Empire had once prided itself on its strategic dominance in the Pacific. By 1945, however, the tides of war had dramatically shifted. Since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Imperial Navy had ruled the seas and skies with near unchecked supremacy. But as the war dragged on, the Allies, particularly the United States, began to regain ground. The critical turning point came after the Battle of Midway in 1942, which saw the Japanese Navy suffer irreparable losses. From that moment onward, the United States, though still engaged on multiple fronts, relentlessly pursued a strategy of island hopping, cutting off Japan's vital resources and steadily pushing towards the Japanese home islands. The landscape of war shifted on February 19, 1944, when the United States began a series of bombing campaigns targeting Japanese industrial and military infrastructure. It was not just about disrupting war production anymore. It was about breaking the will of the people, bringing the war to the very heart of Japan's cities. The air raids became a cornerstone of the Allied strategy to force Japan into submission without a costly invasion. The turning point in this campaign came in late 1944, with the advent of the B-29 Superfortress, a long-range bomber that could strike deep into Japanese territory. These massive aircraft, equipped with state-of-the-art technology, were capable of flying from the Mariana Islands thousands of miles away to drop bombs on Japan's heartland. The scale of the raids escalated quickly, culminating in a campaign that would be known for its ruthless and indiscriminate firebombing of Japanese cities. For the Japanese, the first taste of this new form of warfare came on April 18, 1942, during the Doolittle raid when 16 American bombers, launched from an aircraft carrier, attacked Tokyo itself. Though militarily insignificant, it shocked the Japanese leadership. The bombers had come to their doorstep, a reminder that Japan was no longer invulnerable. But it was the firebombing raids in the months that followed that truly changed the nature of the conflict. By the end of 1944, the scale of the bombing had intensified, with the United States aiming to cripple Japan's manufacturing capability, targeting everything from oil refineries to transportation hubs. Yet it was the decision to attack civilian centers in 1945 that marked a new phase in the war, a phase where the very foundation of Japan's urban existence would be systematically obliterated. As the Allies conducted these raids, Japan's defenses seemed to crumble. The Imperial Air Force, stretched thin by years of war, had little capacity to mount an effective defense. Japan's anti-aircraft defenses were overwhelmed, and its fighter pilots, outclassed by their American counterparts, found themselves unable to prevent the attacks. But even more devastating was the psychological impact on both the military and civilians. The thought of an enemy force that could strike at any moment anywhere with no warning began to wear down the resolve of Japan's leaders. The firebombing raids themselves were designed to exploit a specific vulnerability. Japan's cities, primarily built from wood and paper, were highly susceptible to fire. The bombs dropped by the B-29s were incendiary devices, designed to ignite massive fires that would quickly engulf entire neighborhoods. As these fires spread, they created firestorms, violent updrafts of air that sucked everything into the inferno. Civilians trapped in the flames had no escape. The strategic objective was clear: break Japan's capacity to wage war by destroying its industrial heart, but also to break its spirit. And so as 1945 dawned, the firebombing campaign became a continuous cycle, a relentless assault on Japan's will to fight. The Allied strategy was succeeding, but what the Japanese commanders didn't expect was that the raids would keep coming. What they hadn't prepared for was the sheer scale and persistence of the American air offensive, an offensive that would not pause, even as the war seemed to be drawing toward its conclusion. As the spring of 1945 unfolded, Japan's situation grew ever more dire. The imperial government, struggling to maintain control, found itself cornered both militarily and economically. The United States had already secured key positions in the Pacific, with American forces landing on Iwo Jima in February and Okinawa in April. These victories not only provided vital airfields for the B-29 bombers but also brought American forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The battle for the Pacific was entering its final, devastating phase. The raids on Japan's cities intensified as the Allies worked to destroy the industrial infrastructure that was crucial to Japan's war effort. On March 9, 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo marked one of the most devastating air raids in history. Over 330 B-29 superfortresses dropped thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on the capital, reducing much of the city to rubble. The firestorm that followed was unlike anything the Japanese had ever experienced. Over 100,000 people died in a single night, and nearly 1 million more were left homeless. This horrific event was a turning point. Tokyo, the beating heart of Japan's military-industrial complex, was no longer a symbol of imperial power. It was a charred wasteland, but the firebombing of Tokyo was just the beginning. The Allied air campaign, far from tapering off, only grew in intensity. The United States had made it clear. This would not be a series of sporadic raids but a relentless assault that would continue until Japan's spirit was utterly broken. Over the next several months, dozens of other cities would suffer the same fate as Tokyo. Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, none were spared. On May 24, 1945, the B-29s began firebombing Osaka, and in June they turned their sights to Nagoya. What was intended to be a rapid, crushing end to Japan's war effort now became a campaign of absolute attrition. A tactic designed not only to destroy Japan's military capabilities, but to force the population to see no hope of survival. Despite this mounting devastation, the Japanese military leadership held out hope that they could stave off defeat. Emperor Hirohito and his advisors understood that their nation was in a dire position, but they were unwilling to surrender. The militaristic culture that had been built over decades of expansion had instilled a deep resistance to capitulation. Even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, many within Japan's military hierarchy continued to believe that they could hold out, that somehow, a favorable peace settlement could still be negotiated. The Japanese response to these bombings was shaped by both technological and psychological factors. The air defense systems, which had once been formidable, now seemed like feudal barriers against the relentless might of American bombers. The Imperial Japanese Air Force, once a proud and effective force, was decimated. Japanese pilots, outnumbered and often flying outdated aircraft, could do little to protect their cities. On the ground, the civilian population bore the brunt of the destruction, but their plight was often ignored or downplayed by the military leadership. In many cases, they were told to continue fighting, to persevere, despite the increasingly dire circumstances. One of the greatest sources of shock for Japanese commanders was the realization that the raids were not a temporary measure. After each bombing run, they expected a pause, a moment of respite, but instead the air raids continued with even greater frequency. The B-29s, now operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, could strike with terrifying precision, and their presence was constant. Each raid was a reminder that the world had changed, and Japan's air defenses were powerless to stop it. The firebombing campaign, designed to be overwhelming and exhausting, was succeeding beyond its architects' expectations. Japan's commanders had initially hoped that their naval forces would be enough to force the Allies into a negotiated peace. But after the destruction of their fleet at the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the loss of critical islands, those hopes seemed increasingly unrealistic. By mid-1945, the Japanese military had little capacity left to fight back. and the once proud island empire was teetering on the brink of collapse. Even so, there was a belief that Japan could endure. This mentality would be shattered as the raids continued unabated. In the command rooms, confusion and fear grew. The Japanese military had not been prepared for the intensity and scale of these air raids. The shock of realizing that the attacks were never ending, that there would be no reprieve, created an existential crisis for the high command. With each passing day, the raids grew more devastating, breaking not just the physical infrastructure but the psychological resolve of the leadership. And as the firestorms raged on, Japan's ability to defend itself faded with each new attack. For the Japanese people, the firebombing raids were not just military operations, they were an overwhelming assault on the very fabric of their lives. In the days leading up to the attacks, the mood in Japan had been one of tense expectation. The military leadership, though they knew the air raids were coming, had hoped that the ever-increasing destruction could be contained. But as each raid succeeded the last, that hope quickly evaporated. What had once been distant rumors of bombs falling on distant cities became a relentless reality. In the heart of Tokyo, civilians lived with the knowledge that they might be obliterated at any moment. The city was crowded, and living conditions were harsh. Thousands of people were packed into tight wooden homes, many of which lacked proper plumbing or sanitation. Food was scarce and supplies were dwindling as the war strained resources. The looming threat of air raids had already taken a toll on the population. With air raid shelters packed to the brim, families sheltering in fear under the constant drone of enemy aircraft. The impact of the air raids on the civilians was devastating. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th killed over 100,000 people, mostly women, children, and elderly who could not flee fast enough. It was not just the physical destruction that shocked the people, but the sheer horror of the raids themselves. When incendiary bombs hit, the fires spread rapidly, creating violent updrafts that turned the city into a furnace. Buildings collapsed and streets filled with choking smoke. People were burned alive, trapped in collapsing homes or caught in the fiery storm. The survivors were often forced to flee into the same inferno that consumed their city, with no hope of escape. The shock of losing family members, homes, and livelihoods left deep scars. Many survivors were left in a state of disbelief, unsure of how to continue living amid such devastation. Yet they did continue. In the face of near-total destruction, survivors fought to rebuild their homes, salvage what little they could, and care for the wounded. The will to survive was a testament to the human spirit, but even more so to the brutal resilience that a long history of war had cultivated in Japan's population. On the other side of the conflict, the Allies knew they had to break Japan's ability to keep fighting. But it wasn't just the B-29 bombers themselves that represented a new form of warfare. It was the entire infrastructure of the air campaign that had been meticulously built. The B-29 superfortress, developed by the United States, was one of the most advanced bombers of its time. With a range of over 2,500 miles and the ability to carry more than 20,000 pounds of bombs, the B-29 was capable of reaching Japan's mainland from airfields in the Mariana Islands. For the American planners, the B-29 was seen as the key to turning the tide in the Pacific War. Its precision bombing capabilities, though still developing, were far superior to those of earlier aircraft. The B-29's ability to carry incendiary bombs was a crucial part of the strategy. These bombs, designed to ignite fires in the wooden and paper structures of Japanese cities, were devastatingly effective. The raids themselves were the result of an incredibly well-organized and coordinated effort. Each bombing mission began with the careful selection of targets, industrial zones, transportation hubs, and eventually, the civilian centers that supported Japan's war economy. The bombers would fly in tight formations, escorted by fighter aircraft, and drop their deadly payloads over a period of several hours. As more B-29s joined the campaign, the scale of the raids grew and the Japanese defenses grew more ineffective. With each passing month, the United States conducted more raids, with cities like Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya falling under the bombers' relentless assault. What made these raids particularly devastating was not just the damage they caused in the moment, but their psychological impact on the Japanese leadership. The bombings were unrelenting and ubiquitous, marking an entire generation's experience of warfare. The city-leveling raids of 1945 sent a clear message to Japan's military leadership. No target, no civilian area, was safe. Japan was being dismantled from the inside out, and the B-29 bombers were the spearhead of that destruction. The advent of the B-29 superfortress marked a decisive shift in how wars would be fought in the future. While earlier bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress had been limited by their range and payload capacity, the B-29's advanced technology and long-range capabilities allowed it to conduct bombing raids deep into enemy territory. The design was groundbreaking. A pressurized cabin, powerful engines, and an advanced bomb bay made the B-29 a flying fortress in its own right. But it wasn't just the B-29's physical capabilities that set it apart. It was the methods by which it operated. The development of sophisticated targeting systems, such as the Central Directional Bombing System, allowed the B-29 crews to accurately strike targets, despite the challenges of distance, weather, and enemy resistance. The B-29's ability to carry large quantities of incendiary bombs, designed to start uncontrollable fires in densely populated areas, turned cities into massive firestorms. In many ways, the B-29 represented the culmination of decades of technological innovation in air warfare. From the early days of rudimentary bombers to the sophisticated and terrifying machines of 1945, the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed, and as these bombers took to the skies over Japan, they not only demonstrated the power of technology, they also set the stage for a new kind of warfare, where the focus was not just on defeating armies, but on obliterating entire populations. Amid the chaos of relentless air raids, Japan's leadership found itself grappling with a harsh new reality. The firebombings, initially thought to be part of a temporary and isolated effort, had rapidly become a constant feature of the war. With each raid, the Japanese military command faced growing frustration and disbelief. How could this unstoppable force be halted? Despite their deep military expertise, Japan's commanders had not anticipated this new phase of warfare, which relied not just on strategic brilliance, but on technological superiority and sheer persistence. One key figure in Japan's leadership was General Hideki Tojo, the prime minister and army minister, who had overseen much of Japan's military strategy since the war's early days. He was a staunch advocate of total war and the belief that Japan's survival depended on unyielding resistance. But as the raids continued, even his hardened resolve began to crack. By 1945, Tojo and many of his fellow generals had begun to realize that the possibility of victory was slipping away. Yet surrender remained unthinkable, both due to the nation's code of honor and their entrenched militaristic culture. Tojo's leadership, once resolute in its determination, now faced the brutal reality of an enemy that was simply too powerful to stop. The emperor, Hirohito, though largely ceremonial, also felt the mounting pressure. Throughout the war, he had been kept somewhat insulated from the worst of the military's failures, but the constant air raids began to pierce through the walls of imperial distance. The emperor was well aware of the toll these raids were taking on his people. He was aware of the civilian suffering, the millions of displaced families, and the widespread destruction. As the war ground on, Hirohito began to privately question whether Japan could continue its fight, or if it was time to negotiate peace. Yet his position remained complicated by his own role and Japan's traditional views on surrender. In the face of this unprecedented assault, Japan's high command made a series of decisions that would become central to the final chapter of the war. There was a belief among many of the top military leaders that if Japan could hold out long enough, a favorable peace might be brokered, either through Soviet mediation or the exhaustion of the Allies. But this belief was rooted in desperation rather than realism. The Allies, with their unstoppable B-29 bombers, were not simply conducting air raids, they were dismantling the entire structure of Japan's defense, both material and psychological. As the war approached its final stages, the firebombing raids on Japan sparked intense debates about the morality of such tactics. From the perspective of Allied commanders, the strategy was a necessary evil. They saw it as a way to break Japan's ability to fight without committing to a costly ground invasion. The relentless nature of the air raids, hitting both military and civilian targets, was viewed as a means to force Japan's surrender and end the war as quickly as possible. By this logic, the bombing was justified, The bombers were targeting the infrastructure and population centers that supported the war effort, and the destruction of these targets would hasten Japan's capitulation. However, the moral debate surrounding the raids has been a subject of controversy for decades. The high civilian death toll, over 100,000 people died in the firebombing of Tokyo alone, raises difficult ethical questions. Was it justified to target entire cities, with the certainty that vast numbers of civilians would die, in order to hasten the end of the war? Some argue that these tactics were war crimes as they targeted civilians directly, causing unnecessary suffering. Others contend that the scale of destruction was a harsh but necessary step toward ending a brutal conflict that had already cost millions of lives. The long-term psychological effects on the Japanese population were profound. For many, the bombings shattered the myth of Japan's invincibility. They created an atmosphere of fear and hopelessness where every sound of an approaching airplane brought a rush of terror. In the years following the war, the firebombings became a symbol of the immense cost of total warfare, not just for Japan, but for humanity as a whole. It was a reminder that modern technology, used with ruthless efficiency, could strip away the very fabric of society. From the perspective of the Japanese military, the firebombing raids marked a critical turning point in their understanding of the war. The initial response to the raids was disbelief. For years, Japan had prided itself on its ability to defend against foreign threats, but the B-29 bombers demonstrated the power of technological supremacy, and the air raids revealed a glaring weakness in Japan's defenses. The Imperial Air Force, once a proud and capable force, had been ravaged by years of combat. Pilots were few, training was limited, and their planes were increasingly outdated. The raiders were too numerous, too advanced, and too persistent for Japan's remaining defenses to cope with. At first, Japan's high command tried to respond with conventional air defenses. Anti-aircraft artillery fired into the night sky, and fighter pilots were scrambled, but their efforts were ineffective. The B-29 bombers flying at high altitudes were too difficult to target. Worse, the massive bombers had devastating firepower. On the ground, the civilian population had no protection against the firestorms. Firefighters were powerless as entire neighborhoods burned in the blink of an eye. But as the raids continued, Japan's spirit began to break. The once proud empire, with its military might and superiority, could do little against an enemy that had adapted to the modern battlefield. The desperation was palpable among Japan's high command. The bombers continued to drop incendiaries, the firestorms continued to rage, and the realization set in: Japan could not hold out much longer. The raiders were unstoppable, and their persistence was their greatest weapon. The final phase of Japan's unraveling began in earnest during the summer of 1945. By then, the Allied bombing campaign had pushed the nation to the brink. The city-leveling firebombings, relentless and unceasing, had torn apart Japan's infrastructure and shattered the morale of its civilian population. But the real turning point would come when Japan's military leadership finally grasped the full extent of the war they had unwittingly brought to their own doorstep. On the night of July 9, 1945, just weeks before the end of the war, a new wave of B-29 bombers attacked the city of Kumagaya, a target chosen for its military and industrial importance. This raid was part of an ongoing effort to systematically destroy Japan's remaining resources. The scale of the destruction was beyond anything the Japanese command had anticipated. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama had already been nearly obliterated, but now the raiders were striking smaller, lesser-known cities, effectively rendering entire regions unable to contribute to Japan's war effort. These were no longer isolated raids, they were now continuous, unyielding, and with devastating cumulative effects. As these bombings continued, Japan's leadership realized they had no viable way to stop the raids. The military's once feared Air Force had been decimated, and the civilian defense units were helpless in the face of such a relentless and well-coordinated air assault. The fact that the Allies had taken control of key islands in the Pacific gave them the means to launch bombing raids on a continuous basis. There was no safe haven left. The psychological toll on Japan's commanders was immense. As the firebombings wreaked havoc on the cities, the nation's strategic leadership, including the high command, was confronted with an agonizing truth. Their military infrastructure was destroyed, their civilian population was suffering unimaginable losses, and they could not match the technological and numerical superiority of the United States. The final blow came on the night of July 26, 1945, when the Allied leaders, President Harry Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, issued the Potsdam Declaration. It demanded Japan's immediate surrender, threatening prompt and utter destruction if Japan failed to comply. At this point, Japan's military leadership was well aware that they were on the brink of total collapse, and yet, still unwilling to admit defeat, they clung to the hope of an honorable peace, or at the very least, of holding out long enough to negotiate better terms. But the truth had become undeniable. Japan's fight was no longer about victory, but about survival. With the destruction of their cities, the devastation of their economy, and the complete inability to defend against the relentless B-29 raids, the High Command understood that their military strength had all but vanished. What was left was a nation desperately trying to preserve some semblance of dignity in the face of total defeat. The final turning point came on August 6, 1945, with the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. While the firebombing raids had already devastated Japan's cities, the atomic bomb unleashed a new and terrifying level of destruction. In an instant, Hiroshima, once a bustling city, was reduced to a smoldering ruin. The bomb, dropped by the B-29 Enola Gay, killed an estimated 70,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the following days from radiation sickness and injuries. The impact of Hiroshima was immediate and irreversible. It not only obliterated a major military and industrial hub, but it also shook the very foundation of the Japanese military's resolve. The sheer power of the atomic bomb was unlike anything the Japanese had ever encountered. It was a weapon capable of annihilating entire cities in a single blow, a weapon that left no room for hope, no possibility of resistance. Hiroshima was the ultimate symbol of what awaited Japan if they refused to surrender. But even in the face of such an unprecedented assault, Japan's leadership hesitated. Emperor Hirohito and his advisors knew they had little choice but to act, yet the deep-rooted belief in the honor of continuing the fight weighed heavily on them. The question now was no longer whether they could win, it was whether they could survive with some measure of dignity. In the wake of Hiroshima, the Japanese military's resolve crumbled, and yet there was still a delay. It wasn't until August 9, 1945, when a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, that the full realization of the devastation set in. Nagasaki, too, was leveled in an instant. This second bombing left the Japanese government no choice but to finally accept the inevitability of surrender. The Japanese High Command, already reeling from the continuous air raids, the atomic bombings, and the overwhelming power of the Allies, finally recognized that their only option was to end the war. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation. For the first time, he publicly declared Japan's surrender. The decision was agonizing, made under the unbearable weight of destruction and the total collapse of Japan's military and civilian infrastructure. Hirohito's voice, transmitted through a radio broadcast to a nation that had long held the belief that surrender was a betrayal, marked the end of a war that had cost millions of lives. The raids, both conventional and atomic, had shattered Japan's capacity to continue fighting. The relentless air campaign, the constant bombardment from both conventional firebombs and the atomic bomb, had brought the empire to its knees. The High Command's failure to recognize the scale of the air raids and the devastating potential of the atomic bombs had led them to delay the inevitable. But by the time the surrender was announced, Japan was left in ruins, its cities burned, its military broken, and its people devastated. This moment, the announcement of surrender, marked the true climax of the war in the Pacific. It was the moment when all hope of Japanese victory had vanished. The unceasing air raids, which had seemed like an unstoppable force to Japan's commanders, had not only destroyed the physical infrastructure of the nation, but had broken its will to fight. The firebombing raids, followed by the atomic bombings, had proved that no strategy, no defense, and no resolve could hold back the might of the United States. The days following Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marked the official end of World War II. But the devastation caused by the relentless air raids and the atomic bombings left deep scars on Japan, both physically and psychologically. Japan's cities lay in ruin, much of its infrastructure shattered beyond repair. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, once thriving hubs of commerce, culture, and industry, were now smoldering wastelands. The toll of civilian deaths from the fire bombings and atomic bombings had surpassed 200,000, and the long-term effects of radiation would continue to claim lives for years to come. Yet the physical destruction was only one part of the aftermath. The war had fundamentally altered Japan's position in the world, and the psychological impact of the raids would last far beyond the end of hostilities. The most immediate consequence of the bombings was the loss of civilian life. By the time Japan surrendered, the number of people killed in the firebombing raids, especially those in Tokyo, had reached staggering numbers. In the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945 alone, over 100,000 people were killed, making it one of the deadliest single air raids in history. These raids were not targeted at military installations alone. They were designed to cripple Japan's ability to wage war by destroying its cities and civilian infrastructure. The human cost was overwhelming, and the country was left to pick up the pieces of a society that had been torn apart in a matter of months. Beyond the immediate devastation, Japan's economic collapse was total. With most of its cities obliterated, its factories and industrial capacity destroyed, and its transportation networks in disarray, Japan found itself unable to maintain its war effort or even sustain its civilian population. The economy had already been strained by years of war, but now, with large sections of the country in ruins, Japan faced a monumental task of rebuilding. The destruction was so extensive that it took years for Japan to regain even the basic infrastructure necessary to function as a nation. The psychological impact of the air raids, particularly the firebombings, was profound. The fear of further attacks hung over the population like a dark cloud. The raids had shattered the illusion of Japan's invincibility. The idea that Japan could endure, that it could resist overwhelming force, was destroyed. The Japanese people had witnessed their cities burned to the ground, their families killed or displaced, and their lives uprooted by an enemy they could neither see nor stop. In many ways, the firebombing raids represented the culmination of the trauma of war. They were not just military attacks, they were an assault on the psyche of a nation. The emotional toll on Japan's leadership was also immense. The failure of the military to mount a successful defense against the air raids, and the inability to halt the destruction of Japan's cities, forced Japan's commanders to confront their own impotence. Leaders like General Tojo, who had once confidently led Japan's war effort, were eventually held accountable for their role in the war. Tojo, along with other military leaders, would later be tried for war crimes in the post-war period. But for many in Japan's leadership, the most profound punishment was the realization that their once great empire had been reduced to rubble, and that the war they had waged for so long had ended in utter defeat. For Emperor Hirohito, the aftermath of the bombings and the war itself was equally sobering. While Hirohito's role in Japan's military decisions had remained largely ceremonial, the firebombing raids and the atomic bombings had made it impossible for him to ignore the consequences of Japan's aggressive actions during the war. On August 15, 1945, he delivered his famous radio address to the Japanese people, in which he announced Japan's surrender. This was a watershed moment in Japanese history, as Hirohito was forced to confront the end of an era. The emperor's speech, broadcast over the radio, marked the first time most Japanese people had heard his voice, and it was a moment of profound psychological shift in a nation that had long revered him as a living god. Yet the emperor's decision to surrender, while necessary for Japan's survival, did not erase the sense of loss and devastation that permeated the nation. Japan's surrender had not only ended the war but had also marked the fall of the empire. The loss of territory, the destruction of Japan's industrial base, and the collapse of its military all served to reinforce the idea that Japan's military leadership had failed. For many, the war was not just a defeat, it was a national tragedy, and the consequences of that tragedy would shape Japan for decades to come. In the wake of Japan's surrender, the country faced a long and arduous road to recovery. The immediate aftermath of the war was dominated by the work of rebuilding, both physically and emotionally. The United States, under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, assumed control of Japan's post-war occupation, and the process of transforming Japan from a militaristic empire into a peaceful nation began. This transformation was not just political but also deeply cultural, as the Japanese were forced to come to terms with the reality of their defeat and the devastation wrought by the war. For the Japanese people, the bombings had not only destroyed their cities but also their sense of national identity. The firebombing raids and atomic bombings had left their mark, not just in terms of the physical destruction, but in how the Japanese viewed themselves in the world. The collapse of Japan's imperial ambitions shattered a generation's belief in the superiority of their empire. The idea of divine invincibility, once ingrained in the national psyche, was obliterated by the harsh realities of the war's end. For many, the loss was not just of territory, but of the very foundation of their identity as a proud, dominant nation. As the physical reconstruction of Japan began, the United States poured vast resources into rebuilding the nation. Cities like Tokyo and Osaka, once reduced to rubble, began the slow process of recovery. The devastation caused by the firebombing raids meant that Japan's industrial capacity had to be rebuilt from scratch. Factories were rebuilt, transportation networks restored, and the agricultural sector restructured. The physical scars left by the war would take decades to heal, but Japan's economy slowly began to recover, aided by U.S. financial assistance and the eventual shift toward a more market-oriented, industrialized economy. But perhaps the most profound change was the psychological shift that took place within Japan. The national trauma caused by the bombings and the war forced the country to reconsider its place in the world. For years, Japan had adhered to the idea of military superiority, but this belief was now shattered. The relentless air raids had broken the will of the people and the resolve of the military leadership. Japan's once imperial identity had to be reimagined in a world where it no longer held dominance. And this shift in mentality was part of the occupation's broader goal to demilitarize Japan and ensure that it would never again pose a threat to world peace. The occupation also brought significant changes to Japan's political structure. The old military government was dismantled, and a new constitution was written under the guidance of MacArthur and the Allied forces. The post-war constitution, which came into effect in 1947, included provisions that renounced war as a means of settling international disputes. Article 9 of the Constitution, which renounced Japan's right to maintain military forces, became a cornerstone of post-war Japanese identity and its approach to international relations. However, despite the outward transformation, the psychological scars of the war were deep. Many Japanese civilians carried the trauma of the bombings with them for the rest of their lives. Survivors of the atomic bombings, known as hibakusha, became the living testimony to the horrors of nuclear warfare. These survivors faced not only the physical scars of the bombs, but also the deep emotional trauma of witnessing their cities and families destroyed. For them, the war never truly ended. The psychological burden of the bombings remained, passed down through generations. Moreover, the moral and ethical questions surrounding the firebombings and the atomic bombings continued to resonate in Japan. While the United States had justified the bombings as necessary to end the war quickly and prevent further loss of life, the sheer scale of destruction and the targeting of civilians left a legacy of bitterness and guilt. In the years following the war, Japan and the United States worked to reconcile, but the legacy of the bombings, particularly the atomic attacks, remained a source of tension. For Japan, the bombings were not just a military strategy. They were a symbol of the horrific cost of war, a cost that the world would never forget. On a broader scale, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new era in international relations. The destruction wrought by the atomic bombs and the firebombing raids would influence global military strategies for decades to come. The bombings demonstrated the terrifying potential of modern warfare and the devastating human toll it could exact. For the United States, the atomic bomb was seen as the ultimate weapon, a tool that had ended the war but had also introduced a new, uncontrollable force into the world. The subsequent arms race, which saw the proliferation of nuclear weapons, would shape the geopolitics of the Cold War and beyond. The firebombing raids and atomic bombings of Japan in 1945 stand as some of the most harrowing chapters in the history of modern warfare. They marked not just the end of a global conflict, but a profound shift in the way humanity viewed war, technology, and human suffering. As the war closed, the devastation of cities, the loss of millions of lives, and the psychological scars left on those who survived, forced the world to reckon with the true cost of total warfare. For Japan, the consequences were irreversible. The relentless air raids and the atomic bombings shattered the nation's sense of invincibility, but they also set the stage for the country's post-war rebirth. In the years following the surrender, Japan transformed from a militaristic empire into a peaceful, industrialized nation, driven by the desire to rebuild and to redefine itself. The trauma of the war never left, but it was part of a larger story of recovery and reconciliation. The country's eventual embrace of pacifism, symbolized in its post-war constitution, remains one of the most significant outcomes of the war's end. Yet the bombings, particularly the atomic attacks, raised profound moral and ethical questions that have persisted through the decades. Was the destruction of entire cities, with the loss of countless civilian lives, justified as a means to end the war quickly? Can such devastating actions ever be morally defensible, even in the face of a prolonged and brutal conflict? These questions continue to haunt not just those who lived through the war, but the generations that followed, as the world grappled with the power of nuclear weapons and the consequences of their use. The lessons of the fire bombings and the atomic bombings have transcended the boundaries of history and politics. They serve as a reminder of the horrors that humanity is capable of when war is waged without restraint, and they challenge us to consider the true cost of violence and destruction. The war may have ended in 1945, but the echoes of its devastation reverberate to this day. The firestorms that consumed Japan's cities, the lives lost in an instant, and the survivors left to rebuild their shattered world, these are the haunting legacies that remain. And in the quiet moments of reflection, we are forced to confront the humanity that remains in the wake of such unspeakable destruction. In the end, the events of 1945 were not just a turning point in the history of Japan, but in the history of warfare itself. They mark the moment when humanity reached the apex of destructive potential, where the very fabric of life and civilization could be torn apart by a single raid, a single bomb. It was a moment of reckoning, both for Japan and for the world, and as we look back, we must remember the human cost of those decisions. Not just in the context of the past, but as a stark reminder of the future we must avoid.